So we'll just wait for 30 seconds for people to join.
Sure.
And then
Okay, these numbers will keep increasing as people will be joining. So we can start now. Narayan, if you're good.
yes, we're good. Thank you. So either you or Samakhya, you can start, and then I'll take over.
Samakhi, you are on mute.
Do you want me to start?
Yeah, go ahead.
Great. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who has joined us today for the 13th Michigan India Conference. I would like to welcome you all on behalf of the team. And it was very inspiring to listening to the discussion between Mr. Kamath, Mr. Gopal, and Professor M.S. Krishnan in the previous session. And now we are moving forward to the next fireside chat with Dr. Nageswaran and Mr. Narayan. Dr. Nageswaran is an Indian economist and the 18th Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. After completing doctorate in finance from University of Massachusetts, Amherst, for his work on the empirical behavior of exchange rates, Mr. Nageswaran served as a part-time member of the Economic Advisory Council between 2019 to 2021. He also worked as a visiting professor at Kriya University in Andhra, a professor for graduate students at the Singapore Management University, and at the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore and Indore. Mr. Narayan Ramchandran is a chairman of Team Lee Services Limited and the chairman and general partner of Cluden Acquisition Corporation. Mr. Ramachandran was formerly country head of Morgan Stanley in India and co-head of its global emerging market business. A keen social entrepreneur, he's the chairman of Unitas Capital, India's largest social enterprise investment bank. Mr. Ramachandran also writes a regular column for the Mint newspaper called A Visible Hand. Now, I would like to hand over the conference to these very accomplished speakers who are driving transformation at the very core in India. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Samakhya. Thank you, Suman. And it is my real pleasure to welcome Dr. Anantha Nageswaran, Ananth to me. He's a close friend for over 20 years now, and he and I have worked together and pushed many ideas together in various contexts over the years. I think India is extremely fortunate to have a deep and humble, both at the same time, thinker about economics at the helm as Chief Economic Advisor. As the brief introduction said, Anant started off in Madurai and then went on to get went on to IIM Ahmedabad. Thereafter, got a doctorate degree from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. And over the years has been both a teacher, professor of economics, an influencer, and importantly has also worked in many firms on the street, such as Credit Suisse and Julius Baer. So he brings the perspective of a professor, of a thinker, of a doer, and importantly of a learner to the job of Chief Economic Advisor. So it's my real pleasure to welcome my friend and professional colleague Anantha Nageswaran to the session.
Thank you, Narayan, for those kind words of introduction. Look forward to the conversation. It's a wonderful opportunity to be able to, share some of my ideas through you with the larger audience here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Let me just set the context for some of our audience who may or may not know. We're doing it under the auspice, this series of conferences this year, as it has been for the last 13 or so years, under the auspices of the C.K. Prahalad Michigan India Conference. For those who don't know, Professor C.K. Prahalad was a world-renowned teacher from Michigan, who was known for his strategic thinking and his tireless efforts at inclusive growth and his sort of passionate belief in the success of India and Indians. I think Professor Prahalad passed away in 2010, but if he could see the India of today and the success of Indians in both India and the global stage, he would have had a quiet chuckle and said, now we need to do more for the next 25 years, now that we have gotten to do some of the things that he spoke about. He was the first one to frame this idea of India at 75 as a way to set aspirational goals. And he was very, very clear. His idea was not so much to focus on a literal objective, but more as sort of a direction of travel. And so in the conversation with Anantha, I hope to explore a direction of travel from here forward, rather than, say India will be X trillion on Y date. That is arithmetic if you get the inputs and the environment for those inputs working together. I would like to invite Anant to the conversation by just asking for a quick sort of history tour. We won't belabor this. A lot of you are already students of Indian history and Indian economic history, but I will just ask for a quick tour from Anant, just to place in context what he thinks have been the accomplishments as a baseline for where we need to work on for the future. So Anant, let me keep that end very open and ask you to observe where you've been. TK used to say India had independence twice, first in 47 and again in 91, 92. So let's see if
So I don't know if you want me to start at 91. I was thinking of starting 10 years later at the turn of the millennium. So we basically had a great decade of growth in 2000, in the first decade of the new millennium. We were coming into the new millennium after a series of droughts and the sanctions imposed by Western nations on account of the Pokhran nuclear device testing. And the banking system had gone through a crisis. But as we entered 2000s, the banking system and the non-financial corporate sector, the corporate sector in general, had gotten their balance sheets repaired, and they were ready to start lending and borrowing respectively. And of course, we know the rest is history, as they say. That is when the BRICS term was coined, and India tried to emulate China's GDP growth of around 9% per annum, barring a brief interruption because of the global crisis. That happened actually between 2003 and 2011-12. And then what happened was that boom itself set the stage for the disappointing rest of the second decade, because as was always the case, in optimistic times, people extrapolate those into much longer time frame than warranted. So we had the second decade of the new millennium slightly disappointing growth because the financial system went into a period of stress. Banks had to repair their balance sheets. Corporates had to also work on their balance sheets, reduce debt. And then basically, it's globally well known that when there is a financial system stress, the economic growth rate tends to disappoint. And that is what we faced in the second decade. So now, actually, there is a sort of a mini replay of what happened at the start of the new millennium. Once again, we are on the cusp of a potential lending and investment expansion phase, because once again, banks, non-banks, companies have got their balance sheets in order and they are ready to start investing. And of course, the pandemic has come in the way, and now we have another geopolitical situation as well. But hopefully, basically what has happened is first decade of excellent growth, but some bottlenecks and some imbalances developed. Second decade was payback. And hopefully the third decade would be a decade where we absorb the lessons of the first one, but grow more sustainably. Back to you, Narayan.
Terrific. Okay, so you're optimistic about the coming decade as sort of we're primed for both for investments broadly, including private investment, as well as growth in a broader sense of the term. Maybe I can just pause and sort of look even further ahead and ask you the question. We heard CK speak earlier in a video, and his sort of view for India was a vibrant and just India. I wonder if you'd care to sort of extrapolate that vision or a vision in economic terms for the next 25 years. If I would ask you,
I think
how would you say?
That's as a statement, as an ideal to aspire for. That was a pretty good way to put it. Because vibrancy can be interpreted to connote economic activity, entrepreneurialism, some sort of a drive, innovation, etc. And just making sure that these opportunities for advancement are available to as much of the population as possible. Hopefully for all of them, but for most of them at least, if not for all of them. So that's a pretty comprehensive vision statement to have. And the way that will be translated into reality is, there should be opportunities for education for all, universal primary and secondary education, which then gives people the platform to acquire the skills that they have an aptitude for and that is relevant for them. And separately, and that is as far as the population in terms of opportunities is concerned. At the same time, for a country of this size, there will always be a very small percentage of people who will be needing support from the government in terms of sort of breaking into the center from the periphery. That has to be continuously provided, and it is true even for today's developed countries. That is the second part of the just component that he mentioned. The first part of the vibrancy comes from the fact that the government has to continuously work towards what I call the LIC Raj. Right now, we speak a lot about Indian governments, selling 5% of its stake from LIC, the Life Insurance Corporation. So that is divestment from LIC. What I would like to see is a different kind of divestment from LIC. And my LIC is the license, inspection, and compliance regime. So that divestment needs to happen. And it is there at all levels, union, state, and local governments. If that is continuously pursued, not to mention all the other things like reasonable and simpler to handle tax system, macroeconomic stability, law and order, etc. But more importantly, the entrepreneurialism and the vibrancy in the economy will be sustained only if the state manages by exception. Because right now what we have is still, by and large, notwithstanding good intentions from the political leadership over the years, what is happening is right now is that economic activity is permitted, subject to regulations and compliance being honored. I would like to turn it around the other way, and I would like to see India turn it around the other way, that regulation and compliance will be required, but not at the cost of encouraging economic activity. So the paradigm has to shift more towards enabling rather than controlling and regulating. We have traveled a long way in that direction, but we still have a long way to go. So that would be the key elements of sort of translating the vibrant and the just society and the economy into specific actions and specific aspirational goals.
Terrific, Anand. So we'll get into some of these things and unpack them a little bit. Maybe given your PhD and your expertise, let me start with the macroeconomy, and then we will go into other elements of the microeconomy. I mean, obviously the microeconomy is very interesting, and we can speak about entrepreneurship and innovation and how to make things happen in just a second. But before we get there, let me talk about the macroeconomy, and maybe again, you can connect it to where we are today with the Monetary Policy Committee and an attempt at macroeconomic stability. I think what many people do not realize, and perhaps some people on this conversation don't realize as well, is that macroeconomic stability was one of the core principles on which the East Asian miracle happened. And
Right.
India has taken those steps principally in the last, 7, 8, 9 years, bringing a lot more prudence and macroeconomic stability. So why don't we begin with stability, and then if you can look forward to an era perhaps where maybe the rupee is a reserve currency, if not the reserve currency. Maybe you can look forward to a time where we actually express an objective that says we will have a revenue deficit that is zero or better, and so on. So I'll leave the floor open for you to prognosticate about the macroeconomy.
I should remember not to get too carried away, because it's such a wide canvas you have given me to paint on. I shouldn't be spending too much time painting. No, you are absolutely right, Narayan, in calling out macroeconomic stability as an important bedrock on which the East Asian economic growth story and transformational story was built. And India, to its credit, even though it didn't really display the dynamism of East Asian nations in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, etc., but by and large, even through the extremely restricted regime that India had for the first 30, 40 years, by and large, India has succeeded in maintaining macroeconomic stability. We have had episodes of crisis, of course. In the 80s, we went for an IMF loan, which we repaid earlier than the due date. The 90s, of course, we had the balance of payments crisis, and to some extent, a miniature tantrum in 2013, which India encountered with current account deficit and rupee plunging, etc. But these are all sort of in a 75-year journey, some 2 or 3 episodes you can pick out, especially in the latter part of this history. But by and large, macroeconomic stability has been maintained. And that needs to be there as the guiding principle, even for this decade. If I go back to my earlier remark, that this decade could be a decade of investment and growth, we need to remember not to repeat the mistakes of the first decade. So that is key, macroeconomic stability. And I think we are very much cognizant of that importance right now in the policy circles, whether it is with the RBI or with the government of India. Now, that will naturally pave the way for sustained growth, because throughout these last 25, 30 years, India has averaged roughly 7% real GDP growth. And since the student audience is currently in the United States, we can say that in 1993, our dollar GDP was $250 billion. By 2018, it had come to $2 trillion plus. That's 8 times growth in dollar GDP, despite the fact that Indian rupee had weakened in this period from around 32 all the way to 65, 68 against the US dollar. So that is a fairly creditable achievement. And despite the International Monetary Fund projecting a rupee depreciation of around 3 to 4% in the next 6 years, it does expect the Indian economy to be of the size of $4.5 trillion by 26, 27, 5 years from now. So obviously, at the end of a decade from now, we should be looking at an economy that is somewhere around $6 to $7 trillion. And naturally, that would pave the way for an increased use of Indian rupee, demand for Indian rupee by overseas markets. And you talked about whether India can aspire to be, Indian rupee can aspire to be a global reserve currency. Why not? Because India does tick at the moment some of the most important boxes for it to be an international reserve currency. However, what it doesn't have is the heft, the economic heft and the size. And if that is also achieved, and along with the fact that there is a rule of law, property rights, etc., then rupee can at least aspire to be one of the important reserve currencies, if not the reserve currency. But underneath all of that has to be a recognition of the fact that we can't have frequent currency and banking crisis. We need to keep inflation under control, whether it is 4% or 5 or 6. We can't go back to the double-digit inflation rates we had for a period of 5 years between 2009 and 14, etc. So as long as those boxes remain checked, then I think aspiring for some of the important goals that you mentioned is very possible. I'll stop there. Back to you.
Terrific. So let me move on and let's talk about the sectors of the economy. Broadly speaking, again, for the students who might or might not be familiar with the breakup, every economy can be broken up into sort of agriculture, services, and manufacturing. it is said that India sort of skipped the second stage and went from agriculture to services. So what do you think? Do we need manufacturing? Do we need more manufacturing than we have, which is, in the low teens at the moment? Is it a problem that agriculture, rural economy represents whatever 55% of the population and 15% of the GDP? And how do we correct for this over the next 25 years, if it's worth correction? I've heard some mandarins in Delhi say manufacturing is a low value added part of the economy. We are actually much higher value added because 60% of our economy is in services. So how do you break up this conundrum?
No, you are, first of all, you got the numbers absolutely right. In terms of value added or in terms of GDP, the primary sector, agriculture, is 15%, manufacturing, mining is close to 25%, and services is close to about 60%, the tertiary sector. So the numbers are absolutely right. And I personally think that manufacturing has to play an important part. We did miss the manufacturing bus, so to speak, because we neither had the physical infrastructure in terms of capacity for electricity generation, port, road network, railway network, etc. And we also didn't have the regulatory environment that enable manufacturing entrepreneurialism to bloom. So, but we are removing one of those bottlenecks, which is the physical infrastructure part, and we have there made much more impressive progress than we have made with respect to the other half, which is to create a legal regulatory compliance infrastructure, which will also enable manufacturing to bloom. So I personally think that in terms of its ability to generate greater employment and provide opportunities even for relatively less skilled people, manufacturing will have to play a role. I don't agree with the characterization of India as a country that has deindustrialized. I would actually argue that it didn't industrialize enough, and there is still room for that. Services, of course, is an area of strength which happened, largely by accident, and which is fine. We took advantage of that, and we need to keep that. But even there is still room for relatively low skill intensive or knowledge intensive to the services sector, such as tourism, and that can also play a role. So I would like to see a situation where, primary sector is 30, and the manufacturing come mining goes from 25 to 40, and the services sector, stays around 50% from the current 60%. That would be, I still think that would be an interim goal. But over time, naturally, as the economy becomes larger, and therefore as labor incomes rise, the share of manufacturing will naturally shrink. But before that, we first need to see it reach from around 25 to around 40% or so, and that is doable. And the government's production-linked incentive schemes, which I think we can talk about later, those are all clear recognition of the importance that manufacturing still has a role to play in the Indian economic transformation journey. Back to you.
Why don't you speak a little bit about PLI, as we are calling it, production-linked incentives, and I have a question in the nature of a critique related to that as well. So please go ahead first, and then.
No, I mean, that is a clear recognition that if you look at one of the 5 elements of economic development as characterized by Professor Robert Allen at the University of British Columbia. So for today's developed countries, broadly speaking, had 5 elements in their economic growth path, which is they had universal education, physical infrastructure, sound domestic banking, internal single market, and external trade barriers. These were the 5 elements, as he put it, looking at the history of development of today's developed nations. And in order to have an internal single market, you need to create scale and capacity. And India missed that because of the excessive romanticism with small scale industries. And to some extent, of course, East Asia did industrial policy, but industrial policy was successful in Northeast Asia, not so successful in Southeast Asia. So one can always have a not so efficient industrial policy. And the proof of the pudding will be in the eating in terms of the ability to export, ability to hold competitiveness, and ability to generate domestic employment and income growth. So on those parameters, these are still early days, but the intent is there in welcoming both domestic and foreign manufacturers to set up enterprises of scale such that both domestic market and foreign markets can be catered to. And that is the thought behind the production linked incentive schemes, to create global leaders in several sectors and hopefully kind of fast track the increase in size of manufacturing. That is why in the last 2 years, 14 sectors have been included in the production linked incentive scheme, from mobile phones to pharmaceuticals to renewable energy to auto components to textiles, etc. So hopefully, we need to take dynamic audit of the success of these schemes and do course corrections to make sure that they deliver on the intended goals. But these are still early days on that. Back to you.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, for the benefit of those who are listening, the production link incentives essentially are like an old-fashioned sort of return on each unit of production back to the manufacturer who agrees to put in the PPE, property, plant, and equipment related to manufacturing that item. The nature of the critical question I have for you, Anantha, is: are we attempting too many things? And if we do indeed offer such a sweet deal for so many firms, aren't we then disenfranchising others that are not part of the scheme? Because in a way, the more it begins to look like economy-wide benefits, then you are disadvantaging others, companies who are not operating within sort of this notion of a piece rate discount, if you will, from the government.
No, that's a legitimate question or a concern to have. But as long as the government isn't actively directly picking winners and empowering them, but only those who commit to put money on the ground and willing to produce to be able to export and meet domestic demand as well are getting benefited, and that is open to everybody. So in that sense, it is not a direct method of picking winners, but enabling winners to emerge somewhat spontaneously and organically. So to that extent, those who don't meet the cut cannot really complain that the government disfavored them.
Okay, I think it's a very important point you raise, which is, I think, perhaps slightly distinct from the East Asian model.
That's right.
You are suggesting that capital allocation at the level of the economy is better done by self-selection and by market forces than in any centralized manner. Am I reading you correctly?
No, absolutely. Because I mean, Northeast Asia did that well, even though they did pick specific firms and gave them all kinds of credit subventions and support in return for export strategy. But Southeast Asia didn't do it well. So at least we are avoiding that possible error by not selecting firms ourselves at the government level, but letting the, as you correctly put it, letting the market forces and self-selection to emerge as the basis for these firms to emerge at the national level and at the global level. So absolutely, you got it right. That's what I'm trying to make a distinction between what East Asia did, South or North, compared to what we are doing.
So let me follow on the service sectors. Some people say that India's service sector is actually a tale of two sectors. One sector is sort of globally competitive, almost, not just competitive, but sort of crushing it, to use a young person's term on the global stage. And once again, for IT services and sort of anew for many new areas that includes blockchain and other things that are just coming up. But the other side is that our non-high value added service sector is barely subsistence.
True.
And that we will need to really lift that, be part of the service sector, if you will, if we are to have this inclusive growth.
No, I can't agree with you more. In fact, absolutely agree, because it is important not only from the point of view of export earnings coming from different sectors, but also this low value added service sectors, whether it is mass tourism, hospitality, or even medical services, etc., and education. And I mean, education and health are two areas where India can actually not only become highly competitive and highly quality oriented for domestic purposes, but also can be a source of export earnings. And there we are still lagging behind. And these are actually can be high value added service areas, but right now, the way they are, they look like low value added services. So, and tourism can indeed be an employment generator as well. And I think between tourism, education, health services, I think that there is much more room to create larger employment opportunities and IT-enabled services, etc., which have generated jobs for educated people. So in that sense, even in the services sector, we still have a lot of headroom for growth. And that is, in a way, can be interpreted as actually a positive sign that we still have some fruits to pluck.
So shifting gears a little bit, let's talk about infrastructure, which is obviously one of the most important things to enable any of these accomplishments to come to be. And this debate, particularly over the last 20 years, has sort of always been there, which is we know we need, pick a number, 1 trillion, 2 trillion over any 10, 20-year period. And how do we generate that? Now, we've done a good job of building roads. We have done a good job of extending that road system now under the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana to the rural area from what was originally just sort of linking the big cities. We've done a good job with what we fashionably call minor ports, but they're quite large by our economy standards. We have done an average-ish job on airports. We've done a terrible job of internal waterways, and so on. So we've had a little sort of patchwork of very good and not so good, and we still have the open question about where the money will come from.
Yeah.
Though I think the good news is that the intent is very clear and very well aligned with the national agenda. Am I reading all this correctly?
No, I think you're absolutely right in your scorecard, first of all, about which sectors of the infrastructure area we have done well and where we haven't done. I think that is again, it's difficult to quibble with how you characterized it. And yes, in terms of resources, one thing is that our domestic savings rate has stagnated at around 30%. After having reached 37% in 2007-8, it has come down. And I think many countries that are today developed countries, especially in East Asia, had a persistently high savings rate in the mid to late 30s, north of the, towards high 30s. And they sustained it for a decade or even two, in order to be able to generate the resources. Of course, we know that savings is endogenous. I mean, income growth has to happen, employment generation, and then savings also happen. So bulk of the resources indeed has to come from Indian domestic savings, which should also include our public sector, because India's private, corporate, and household savings to some extent is not going towards capital accumulation or capital formation, because the government system as a whole, union and state governments, are net dissavers. And for the amount of deficit spending, the quality aspect is still relatively on the low side. So that if our governments can also be somewhat lower dissavers, and that is why your earlier question about zero revenue deficit, etc., come into play. If that happens, then more and more resources will be available for this infrastructure needs that you're talking about. Of course, we will depend at the margin on foreign funding, but it has to be at the margin. It can't be your central source of funding. So it has to be domestically generated. Private savings have to go up, and ultimately that is a function of restoring growth rates, at least if not to the extent we had in the first decade of the new millennium, but 70 to 80% of that would generate the internal resources required to meet at least 60 to 70% of the infrastructure funding requirements ourselves. Back to you.
Let me push that a little bit, and here I have not a question in terms of direction of what you're saying, but more in question of magnitude.
Yeah.
So again, linking back to sort of CK's idea, CK was always a believer that Indian human talent internally is of great importance, and that human talent externally is also of great importance. And over the last 15 or 20 years, that has proved to be dramatically positive, and right. The implication of that in pure economic terms, and I don't want to distill it only to pure economic terms, but just for the sake of this conversation, is the enormously positive and ultra stable remittance economy that India has of nearly $80 billion. I mean, it is single-handedly, along with the IT services business, responsible for keeping India's current account solvent and manageable and low most of the time, as you pointed out earlier. So, how do we go from that sort of 80, 100, $120 billion of financing to $1 trillion of financing without externality? Now, I'm not suggesting that India abandon its mixed model, but and here I will directly question some of the priorities of the government, but shouldn't it be interdependence as an articulated method over the next 25, I don't know about 25 years, but at least 10 or 15 years? For instance, the way China did it through the WTO period from 2001 to 2015?
So if I understand you correctly, Narayan, are you sort of saying that with the current policy configuration, we may not be able to generate the $1 trillion investment resources that we need for infrastructure because we are too dependent on remittances and also foreign direct investment? I'm not entirely sure.
I'm just saying we are dependent on remittances, which is a good thing, at least those that is directly related to Indian human capital.
Right.
But that magnitude may or may not be sufficient for the aspiration that we have, right? So therefore, do you characterize a forward 10 or 15 years as importantly interdependent as opposed to self-reliant?
No, I don't think both need not necessarily have to be mutually exclusive. I kind of get where you're coming from. So I think the fact that the government has gone around, actively seeking free trade agreements and even the production-linked incentive schemes not being confined only to Indian domestic manufacturers are two clear and very strong and compelling evidence in my mind that it is not purely a self-reliant economy, but it is also self-reliant come recognition of interdependence. And that is where I think I see a point. China did take advantage of the WTO entry in 2001 and allowed its exports to be an important driver of the domestic investment and infrastructure build-out agenda as well through its export growth. That is what you mean by, I think, interdependence rather than sort of I think that the point is well taken, and I don't think the government is discounting or neglecting the importance of this external orientation, because as you know very well, this financial year that just ended in March 2022, we did achieve export target of around $418 billion with a run rate of close to $480 billion per annum if you look at the last few months alone, and that is close to $500 billion. And we do have a fairly ambitious target of $1 trillion in exports in the next 5 years or so. So and clearly, with so many free trade and economic partnership agreements under progress, the interdependence argument that you made very correctly is well recognized. And I wouldn't therefore think that self-reliance and interdependence are mutually exclusive. I think in this particular instance, they do both go hand in hand. Back to you.
So extending that question, should India look at free trade agreements that are, the fancy jargon term is plurilateral, as opposed to merely bilateral? And for instance, should India join RCEP, or should India join any of the other sort of multi-country arrangements in order for India's own benefit, for India's economic security, which of course ties in with India's national security?
So India does have an agreement with a large group such as ASEAN, and it is negotiating with the European Union. So you can consider them as plurilateral, as you put it. But Australia signed up to RCEP, But that didn't prevent Australia and China from entering into a very nasty trade war in which Australian interests were hurt, and export duties and import duties on many Australian products were raised by China, notwithstanding the fact they both were signatories to the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. So I think if everybody in the game is not willing to play by the rules, then there is no point in entering the arena. And I think what India did was right with respect to the RCEP, and India is right to pursue free trade agreements, despite the fact that as a country with a slightly higher level of average import duties, in any free trade agreement, India has more to give than to gain. Because after all, other countries already have zero import duties on many products. So when India eliminates duties and others give India zero duty access, then what happens is India doesn't gain, because India is merely competing with other countries which already have a zero duty access to these countries like Australia or UAE, etc. So that actually forces the Indian manufacturers to become competitive and look at other areas in terms of competing with those countries that already have a zero duty access. So in that sense, these bilateral agreements are a good way also to force Indian manufacturing to take advantage of the zero duty access by looking at their costs and productivity. And that is where, of course, an important initiative, some of your audience may not know about it, called this Gati Shakti dashboard, which is sort of an information dashboard between different ministries in the government, such that projects are sequenced properly and eliminating time and cost overruns. And in the end, logistics costs should come down, because India has one of the higher logistics costs in the world, from reaching a good from a factory to the port or the airport before it is shipped out. I think those are the ways in which India has to compete. And there, I would say bilateral economic partnership agreements can be as effective. And some of these do include a large club of nations such as the EU and ASEAN, etc. So I think there we are on the right track.
So Anant, let me close the conversation, or open the last question with this thing about innovation and about digital and startup and all of that good stuff. We actually have a full day on the third session of the speaking, second and third session of the speaking about that. But at the level of the economy, how do you think about, you know, the absolute explosion of entrepreneurship, which many years ago started as sort of labor arbitrage, but now is truly productizing and is ready, at least in segments, to conquer the world. So
no, I think you had already put it so well that it's difficult for me to do better than that, because it was more of a statement rather than a question on your of what you said. So clearly, yes, I mean we have done very well, and this startup ecosystem is indeed maturing, and you are actually a fairly important player in this entire startup ecosystem space yourself personally, so you know far more than I do. But what I would love to see happen from a policy perspective is that this spirit of entrepreneurialism that is now spreading out quite apart from the big metros into even second tier cities, and now any engineering institution or a management institution worth its name in the country, not just the IIMs and the IITs, have incubation, have startup promotion centers and tie-ups, etc. are happening. That's fantastic. But we still have to create what we call, what Germans call a Mittelstand. India doesn't have enough medium-sized enterprises. So this startup boom or revolution that is happening in specific sectors needs to become much more pervasive, much wider. And for that, I think much more policy action needs to happen, not just for encouraging startups, but to keep them going as a going concern. And that requires further work from the regulatory and the policy angle. That is when we can say the spirit of entrepreneurialism is well and truly alive, because we still do not give enough support to our entrepreneurs in terms of the policy space, and also in terms of their working capital requirements, in making sure that they have access to finance. We still have a long way to go. And that is when that happens, then we can all say that it's a job well done.
Thank you, Anant. It's an absolute pleasure to speak with you, and I hope the people listening to this have got a sort of a little glimpse into the clarity and the absolute principle-based observations that Anant is making. There were several nuggets in there, so if you haven't caught them all, I can't summarize all of them again without having to speak about virtually every moment of our conversation. But do take a listen to the transcripts if you so wish. But I would say once again, thank you, Anant, and I think we are indeed very happy that you have been appointed to this position just recently, and I think you will do India proud.
Thank you, Narayan, for those kind words. And it is, as always, whether it is informal or formal, it's indeed a pleasure and a good testing exercise to have a conversation with you always.
Thank you. Samakhya, Suman, you want to wrap up, or what's the next step?
Hello, Narayan. It should be fine. I'll just check with Sherry how to close the bridge. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you all for listening. Good night, good day, and good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This continues into the next session.
Sherry, there is no next session, so you can just close this bridge.
Oh, okay.
We are not continuing. Sorry, 1 second. Did you?
What?
No, I'm talking to her. Samakhya, I think the CK Prahlad, do you guys want to continue, or you want to close this? Because if we close this, then we won't be able to come back on this.
We can close this one. I don't think anyone would be joining this session now, because no speaker is there, right? So we can.
Oh no, this was supposed to be with the professor for CK Prahlad. I mean, that was there in the agenda.
No. CK Prahlad is on a different bridge altogether.
Okay, so let's close this. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Sherry. Thanks, Bhumika.